Welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Of course, tonight we're getting ready with our first class this evening, but before we get into that, let me first do my introductions and then kind of offer other apologies to those of you who were on Zoom who couldn't make it yesterday evening. My name is Robert Green II. I'm an assistant professor of history at Claflin University, and I'm also the lead instructor for the Modjeska School. And of course, last night, those of us who were here at the Grow building in person had a wonderful opportunity to actually meet each other and to get to know each other. Unfortunately, thanks to technology and thanks to hacking, we were unable to invite the folks via Zoom to come and join us yesterday afternoon. So once again, I do apologize for that on behalf of the school. So what we'll be doing during the course of the semester is each evening, we will have a handful of folks actually introduce themselves, give us their names, give us where they're coming in from. We're going to start that tonight. I think I would like to do that actually at the end of our class this evening, so we can kind of jump right into tonight's discussion. But be aware that we'll call on folks at the end of class tonight to do those introductions, and we'll keep going from there during each class this semester. All right, so if you've not already taken a look at the structure of the Modjeska School semester, what you will notice is that for the semester, we're actually starting off with pre-European history. We believe that to understand South Carolina's history fully, you don't start with European arrival in the 16th or 17th century. Instead, you need to start with the peoples who were actually here before the Spaniards and the English arrived in those various time periods. And so tonight, we are honored to have two very special guests, two individuals who have already contributed a great deal to the Modjeska School over the years and are here once again to talk a bit about their specialties. First, I wish to introduce Chris Judge, Assistant Director of Native American Studies at USC Lancaster. Judge has done a lot in terms of talking about the history of indigenous peoples here in the Palmetto States elsewhere. And I can tell you that you are in for a treat learning from Professor Judge. After that, we have Dr. Burnette Gallman, who is a Columbia area physician and also a member of the Modjeska School Board of Directors, who will talk a bit about African history before the transatlantic slave trade. The purpose of tonight's conversation is really to get across the idea that the histories of indigenous and African peoples do not begin when they first encounter peoples of European descent. Instead, both of those wide-ranging ethnic and racial groups had rich, wonderful histories that we're going to learn some about this evening. So without further ado, please welcome up Professor Chris Judge.
Good evening, everybody. I want to talk to you tonight about Native Americans in South Carolina. I'm going to give you an overview of the last 13 or 14,000 years very quickly. And then into the historic period when the invasion arrives and the impact to Native American communities begins. You probably know that there are some 12,000, maybe 16,000 years of Native Americans in South Carolina. We keep pushing that date back. But during the last ice age, there were people here in South Carolina. There's many sites that have produced sites of this nature. They're very small groups of people who are highly mobile. They have a very lightweight toolkit, and they move constantly. Part of what they're doing is they are following herd animals like mastodon, woolly mammoth, and bison, who go where it rains. They're going to where there's good grass and pasture. So the people kind of move around. We see them moving up and down rivers. Their sites are along major rivers where large creeks meet the river. It's sort of like where the interstate highway has an exit. You get off there and you know you're going to find a place to stay, a place to eat, and you forgot your toothbrush, you're going to go to Walgreens and get another. So the resources are there. Okay, so they're very similar to these kind of places. These folks hunted these now extinct animals for the most part, but made wide use of other things. And the only thing we really find are their stone tools. We find the spear points from that period. At 10,000 years ago, the ice age comes to an end. South Carolina warms up, the vegetation changes. It's hard to believe, but there were no pine trees in South Carolina during the age.
Wow.
Now, most of them today are planted, but we would have had a natural habitat of longleaf pine. It was mainly a hardwood forest. But after it warms up, after 10,000 years ago, the vegetation changes, the climate changes, and human response to that change is rather dramatic. The animals that they hunted, 25 to 30 species, extinct. And so the technology has to change to meet that. And they enter into a period that we call the Archaic for a very long period of time, where they're adapting to this changing environment. They've changed their spears from a stabbing spear. You walk up to a mastodon and you penetrate the rib cage and put blood into the lungs. It's the only way to kill them. To hunting white-tailed deer, who will not allow you to do that. And so they invent a spear throwing device, and the spear point technology changes. But these people are highly mobile. They're moving in a seasonal round from the mountains to the sea, we think, taking advantage of resources as they come available. Now, I am on spring break. Where do students go? Spring break. A lot of them go to the beach. I don't know why. They go to the beach. So that's what people did. They went down there because, the azaleas are starting to bloom here, but they've been blooming in Charleston for a while. That means that the vegetation is available and the fruits of the vegetation are available much earlier at the coast. So they go down there. They spend the summer moving back up into the coastal plain, into the Piedmont for fall, where they're collecting mast foods, black walnuts, hickory, acorns, the animals that gorge on them, deer and bear, and then preparing for winter when they kind of sit on the fall line, and then the whole thing starts over. Around 5,000 years ago, we see some dramatic changes. We see some innovations. We see a container revolution. Up till now, there are no fire durable containers. There's no pottery. There's no stone containers, but at 5,000, we see that shift. And the reason we think is they're starting to make use of starchy seeds. And you have to slow simmer starchy seeds, right? You cannot eat rice out of the bag. I mean, maybe you can, but I don't recommend it. So you have to slow simmer. So we need containers that are fire durable at that point. And we see clay vessels invented. We see stone vessels invented. And we start to see at the coast some monuments, if you will. They're starting to take their refuse, their landfill materials, largely shellfish remains, and they're building things. This is the Fig Island complex on the north end of Edisto Island. This one is 800 feet long. Let me do it on the screen. This one is 800 feet long, 600 feet wide, and it's 40 feet tall of Native American garbage, mainly shell, but there's animal bone in there, there's broken pottery in there, broken spear points are in there, and the function of these is really unknown. But they went to a lot of trouble to build these. There's 15 complexes like this on the South Carolina coast. We don't know if it's conspicuous consumption. Hey, look, mine's bigger than you. Are they villages? They got people in a circle with their houses, and my shell garbage near my house grows to Roberts, or Roberts grows over to Brent, and it comes back around into a feature that's eventually manipulated and organized into the features that we see. And these are really interesting. The pottery that Native Americans built in South Carolina is the oldest pottery tradition in the United States, more so than the Southwest that we associate with pottery and being very early. So they're living and they are accumulating garbage. At some point, the household garbage is taken to these sites and used as a fill. So you've got some control, some leaders, you have some engineering, and then you have a lot of laborers who are organized. And perhaps these are times when people have massive feasts and get-togethers and work parties to do these kind of things. The introduction of pottery leads us into something called the woodland period. In the woodland period, people start to settle down, they stay in villages, pottery expands, and they start to do what we call horticulture in archaeology. It's the cultivation of native plants, not corn and other things that are exotic and come from other places. So we see a whole bunch of things you probably never heard of unless you're a botanist. Chenopodium, maygrass, sumpweed, little barley, erect knotweed, all that have really tiny seeds. They're not economically viable in a world where there's corn and wheat and rye and other things. And pottery just expands exponentially. About 1,000 years ago, it changes again. We see influence from the Mississippi River, mound building, creation of large mounds in central towns, the arrival of corn agriculture as the staple food. So up until now, people are hunter-gatherers. They're ranging widely, foraging, taking things out of nature for use of food, but they're really not manipulating the environment very much. When corn farming comes, they're clearing large areas along the river. They're building large villages, putting walls around them, and outside they're gardening and as their main food source, and growing lots of corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, things like that. And then these towns would look something like this, where you have multiple mounds. Leaders of politics and religion would live on the top of the mounds with their families and other kinds of associates. There were large central plazas in the center of these towns where activities could take place. There was often gaming. They played a game called Chunky, where they rolled a disc along the ground, shot their arrows where they thought it would stop rolling. In another version, you throw sticks and try to knock it down. And these were central features of the town, and kind of like in America, baseball was, things that people would gather around, cheer, bet on. And early European explorers, of course, saw the Native Americans in this kind of a way. However, 1492, everything changed in this part of the world, as you know. There was an invasion, and this invasion was really horrible on Native American people. There's some estimates that within 25 years of 1492, that 25,000 Arawak-speaking Native Americans would be dead. They're dead from, what do you think?
Disease.
Disease is long thought to be the main one. Slavery is probably even bigger now as we kind of revise our thinking on that, but absolutely European introduced diseases were introduced, and Bartolome de las Casas was a priest who documented this. He argued for the humane treatment of Native Americans, which was kind of interesting at this time period. And unfortunately, he was the one who said, maybe we should go to Africa and get slaves. And the only reason he did it was because many of the people that could be forced into slavery in this part of the world were either already in slavery or were dead, which is really horrible. And this one always amazing. He writes, they made low, wide gallows on which the hanged victim feet almost touched the ground, stringed up their victims in lots of 13 in memory of our Redeemer and the 12 disciples, then set burning wood at their feet and thus burned them alive. These are documented things. Now, Columbus went home in chains, but he kind of vindicated himself and got out of the crimes that he was accused of in this part of the world. So when the Caribbean ran out of slaves, the next place to go was the southeastern United States. Okay? And this is an early map from the 1520s showing the coast of South Carolina up here. There's Cape Romaine. This is Beaufort down here. The River Jordan is the Santee River down here. And so eyes were set on this area. And Lucas Vacquez de Allion had a settlement in 1526 after a exploratory visit in 1521 in the area of Winyah Bay in Georgetown County. They go in there, but we think they end up moving down south. Now, what happened was in 1521, they kidnapped a man that they Christianized in John Francisco de Chicora. They brought him back to the Caribbean and taught him Spanish. He told them that his area was incredibly he bragged a lot about his land being incredibly agriculturally productive. If you think about it, Georgetown County, most of our coast is very sandy. There's pockets of places to do agriculture, but not a lot of places. Now, Allion himself dies. I think there's hundreds of people that die. Their African slaves mutiny and go to live with the Indians. And the whole colony is a failure. And archaeologists, we've been searching for a long time for it. In 1540, May of 1540, Hernando de Soto marches through the southeastern United States, having landed in the coast of Florida, and then going up a wintering amongst the Appalachians, which is in an eyesight of the capital of Florida in Tallahassee, and then marched up to a place called Cofetacheki, which we think is Camden, South Carolina. And the reason they went there, they were supposed to go overland from Florida to Mexico. Why would you walk to Camden, South Carolina? Well, they were interested in gold and silver, and so the soldiers showed the Indians their jewelry. We want this, and they showed them the chains and the rings and the things like that. And they meet a couple of young boys who are from Cofetacheki in Tallahassee, and they say, "We've got gold and silver." So the Soto marches all the way to Cofetacheki in Camden, and after a few days, he decides, "I've been around long enough, it's time to go for the punch." And they ask, "Where's gold and silver?" And the Indians bring it out. They roll out the silver. It's mica, a mineral from the Appalachian. It looks like silver foil, which we call it when I was growing up, aluminum foil. They roll out the gold, native copper. To the uninitiated, it looks like gold. So they turn around and they try to walk to Mexico unsuccessful. 1566, there is a settlement on the coast of South Carolina called Santa Elena. It's the Spanish capital of Florida till 1576, and it's abandoned in 1587. They're starving there, so much so that the governor sends the soldiers into the interior to look for gold and silver in the place where they've already failed, right? But it's to get the soldiers out and be fed by foraging off the land. And then these Spanish expeditions were reliant on going to these mounted Indian communities and eating out of these massive storehouses of corn, beans, and squash that they had grown and stored for the year. De Soto had 600 men with him. Ordo had about 150.
Put your camera on. I tried to.
So the Spanish era is brutal. They torture Native Americans, they enslave Native Americans. And then, of course, there's a little bit of a segue in European settlement until the founding of Charleston in 1670 by the British. In 1670, Henry Woodward, who's an Indian trader, goes up to Cofetacheki, and he thinks it's the most delicious country that he's ever been in. And he feels like if it was cultivated, it would be another paradise. Within 2 years, he says there's 1,000 bowmen living there. So there's 1,000 military people. Within 2 years, it's completely gone. And it looks like the natives see the writing on the wall. Like, oh no, here it comes again. Looks like they're going to stay and colonize and take up the land. So pretty soon, the Native Americans of Cofetacheki, when De Soto got there, was led by a woman. We think she had sway over about Asheville, North Carolina, all the way to Charleston. So giant province and very powerful, just falls apart. Now, March of 1675, the Lord's proprietors exchanged for a valuable parcel of cloth, hatchets, beads, and other goods and manufacture. A deed for about 12,000 acres from the Kiowa. And you can see all the different Indian chiefs that signed this document. Very interesting to me, almost half of them are women. So female leaders were not uncommon amongst native populations in the Carolinas. Now, what was the first industry in South Carolina by the British? Everyone says rice, deerskin trade. In Europe, the forests have been denuded by the Industrial Revolution. There was just forests gone and the animals that live in the forest. They needed skins for clothing, for shoes, and furs for hats and things like that. So the early industry of Carolina is in the deerskin trade. And for the people involved in this, like Henry Woodward, who goes to Cofetacheki in 1670, was rather lucrative. But it changes Indian society because instead of hunting for the family and bringing food home, they're hunting to get skins and march to Charleston and trade for guns, powder, rum, glass beads, industrially produced textiles, and things like that. And unfortunately, most of the traders that were willing to go into the interior and trade with the Indians were uneducated, illiterate, unscrupulous people. And they felt like they could take advantage of the native people who were just as smart as they were, but just in very different ways. And so, of course, the native people realized that they were being taken advantage of. By 1715, this had led to such unrest that the colonial government at Charleston sent 3 Indian traders to the Yamasee Indian town of Pocatello, which we think is either in Beaufort or Jasper County. The idea was those 3 guys were going there to talk to the 10 town leaders of the Yamasee, who had left St. Augustine in 1684 and sought asylum in South Carolina when they fell foul of the Spanish there over slavery and other issues. They go up there to take the names of the traders with the idea, we're going back to Charleston, we're going to call them in, and we're going to bring them to court, we're going to charge them with these abuses because the colonial officials knew peaceful relations with the Indians were of utmost importance to the colony. There were more native people than there were colonists, and if they all got together, they could wreak havoc. Well, Thomas Moran and 2 other traders go up there, they take down the names, they eat dinner, they go to their cabins for the evening. In the middle of the night, they grab them. Thomas Moran is killed over a period of several days. They hammer fat lighter splints into his body and light him on fire, and in essence, he melted. Which I'm sure the native people thought was a just punishment for him and all the possible. Once this happens, native people from across the Southeast join this. This is a multi-ethnic, multinational group of natives that come to attack, and they move from Beaufort on their way to Charleston. The militia is called out. The insurrection is put down, if you will. And by 1717, the Yamasee have been chased out of South Carolina, and they narrowly avert the attack. And so most of these battles are along the Savannah River and along the coast. Now, after this war, they decide, we don't want native people coming to Charleston. We're going to set forts, trading forts in the interior. The natives will come to these forts, and white people will take the goods down to Charleston. So they established Fort Congaree, which is just across the Congaree River here on Congaree Creek. It's in the 12,000-year history park that the River Alliance is developing. Fort Moore on the Savannah River in North Augusta, and then another one out on either the Black River or the PD River. And so people come to the fall line, but the native people are basically pushed out of the coastal plain of South Carolina. Some people live in pockets down there. And so these 3 forts are established. This allows for really Georgetown to take off, later Savannah, and for Charleston to be kind of buffered by 100 miles to where most of the native people are now live. Philip Von Wreck was in the lower Savannah in 1736, and he makes these beautiful watercolors of the native people. I always like these because they give us a sense of the acculturation that is taking place. So if you notice, I think this is a pregnant woman over here. She's got like some kind of backpack that's of native design. She's wearing a European blanket, but she has a bow and arrow. Her companion has a very similar backpack. He also has a blanket, but look, he's carrying a trade gun, a flintlock firearm. He's got a gourd in his hand, which I'm guessing is his black powder to keep dry. And this gentleman over here is smoking one of those long colonial pipes, British made or Dutch made clay pipes, and he's wearing silk stockings, which men and women both wore back in European and native. And so it shows us by 1736, the change is kind of on in terms of acculturation. Here's a camp that he drew, and I could imagine this being 10,000 years ago with a couple of exceptions. Did anybody notice anything that might stand out? Iron kettles. Iron kettles. Now, after the Yamasee War, and after the forts are established, the Indians are now being pushed from the fall line where we live further into the Piedmont. And one of the places that they coalesced was in the Catawba Nation. And this is a map. It's drawn on a deer skin. In 1721, it's presented to Governor Nicholson of South Carolina, colonial governor, and it shows what the Catawba Nation looked like. And in the very center is Nassau Town, the Old English, the S looks like an F. And this is where the chief lived, the Catawba lived. If you notice, all these other villages must go through his town in order to go to Charleston or Virginia, which is really interesting. The Chickasaw and the Cherokee up here in the corner here, they're allowed to go around all of that. But what we see are a lot of the low country tribes. Here's the Watery tribe. You have the Cheraw tribe. The Pee are living there. The Coosa are living there. There's some Yamasee living there. And what this is kind of strength in numbers. As they're being pushed out, they're coming to live in one place. Now in 1740, Bernie's probably going to talk about this. I won't talk too much about it, but the Slave Code of 1740 wreaked havoc on everybody who wasn't white in South Carolina. And you see the names of all the ones that you're not allowed to do anything. You are now a slave unless you've been granted your freedom. And so Indians are included in the Slave Code. 1715, historians believe that 1/3 of enslaved people in South Carolina are Native. So there's this kind of shared experience, if you will. Many of the Native slaves were sent to the Caribbean so they couldn't run home, work in the sugar plantations. This one is really interesting. To restrain the wanderings and meetings of Negroes and other slaves at all times, and more especially on Saturday nights, Sundays and other holidays, the use and carrying of wooden swords and other mischievous and dangerous weapons, or using or keeping of drums, horns, and other loud, they have outlawed music. Central to all cultures. And they are trying to take it out. You know, if you go to a slave village before 1740, it looks like African village. They're making their own pottery, they're building their own houses, and they're trying to wipe out the Indian way of life as well. Now, most extreme, it outlawed reading already. If you want to get somebody's culture, you take their language. Now, Governor Glenn, 1743 to 1756, is a pretty forward-thinking guy, and he's very aware that Indian relations are key to their commerce, of course, but also to the safety of the young. And so he really tried to work hard at Indian relations, but it was not successful. The Catawbas get a reservation at the Treaty of Augusta in 1763. It's 144,000 acres. This is in the area where all these towns were previously. But by this time, it's really one group. They've kind of all melded together. If I go back real quick, these folks, I think, are trying to preserve their ethnic identity, their language, and their ways of life, and their own leaders and their families. So living in separate towns, but close to one another. All right. A really interesting aside, Native Americans, since the time of the Yamasee War in South Carolina, have fought for the colonists and then the Americans in every war till this day in incredibly high numbers. And they're incredibly proud of their military service. To me, this is really an enigma. I don't understand that, because it's a country that really is not treating them very well. Now, from this time forward, Native people are starting to become invisible in record keeping, so many different documents. And from 1790 to 1840, Native Americans are not enumerated in the census. That's a long period of time. And really prior to 1900, there's not a lot of census of Native American communities. And beginning in 1900, they do start to become enumerated. But that's a long enough period of time for them to become invisible. And what happens is the people taking the census go in there, and they're probably afraid of those people. So they're like, they look black, they look Indian, I don't know what they are. And so and the other thing is that they're being called free persons of color, mulattoes, and other things, that Native Americans are probably being included along with African Americans. Now, this guy is not a very good friend of Native Americans, as we all know. We have Andrew Jackson State Park is 9 miles away from the Native American Studies Center where I work. One time a Cherokee artist was coming down, he said, I almost turned around and went back home. You guys are honoring this guy, Andrew Jackson. But he's from, he was born up in Lancaster County or somewhere up in that area. They kind of fight North Carolina and amongst them. But he said that those tribes could not exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. What human group does not want all of those things? No human, they all want that. If we treat them as if they're a subspecies of the humans, it's a lot easier for people to treat them badly.
That's what they're doing to the immigrants now.
It's the same old story, isn't it? If you can't hear what that lady just said, it's what we're doing to the immigrants today. Thank you for that. A lot of the Native American traditions have been lost. We went down to interview some of the Beaver Creek Indians in Orangeburg a few years back, and they said, "Who do you want to interview?" We're like, "Well, the chief and the artist, and who's the oldest person in the room? You know, to tell us about what it was like a long time ago." They said, "We got a 90-year-old woman. She loves to talk." We're like, "Put her in front of the camera." And so we're talking to her, and my colleague Stephen Crystal, after a while, says, "Hey, you haven't talked about your childhood. What was it like growing up in South Carolina being Native American?" She said, "Honey, I didn't know I was an Indian until I was 80 years old." And our jaws both hit the floor. I'm sure there was a thud, because she told us she was from a community that we knew then and now as everyone is a Native American. You know how they had black and white schools in South Carolina? They had Indian schools, and she went to one. Her family did not want her to identify as a Native American. Now, that's an extreme example. We know a lot of people who said at church and in the house, the people you know, you can identify as Indian, but don't dare do it with people that you don't know, because they wanted to pass. They wanted to pass as white. They wanted to pass as black in some cases, because Indians were kind of at the bottom of the stack. Oh, pottery has survived. Again, that oldest pottery tradition in the United States. Here it is in 1909. The Catawbas practice this pottery today. Hand-built, they dig their own clay, they don't use a wheel. And so that long tradition of the oldest pottery continues to this day amongst the Catawba. This is a family near Somerville. Marion Post Wolcott in 1938 came through South Carolina. I think it's a Dust Bowl era projects, probably WPA kind of projects for the Library of Congress. And this is a group, mixed breed brass ankle. Brass ankle is a derogatory term for Native Americans, but here's a family standing in front of their kind of like a sharecropper house. I love that woman's jacket. I think that's just amazing. And her hat. And you know, you might not recognize those people as Native American. If you went down, they live like a lot of their neighbors, white and black. There's a closer look. Now, kind of moving to what's going on today. There are 8 recognized tribes in South Carolina. In 2005, an ad hoc committee was started by Governor Jim Hodges. Under Mark Sanford, Governor Mark Sanford, there was a program to become state recognized as Native American tribes. And I've been kind of involved in this process from the beginning, and I think this is a travesty. Why do you have to prove who you are? It's just the most unbelievable thing. But they have to go through a long process of what is your genealogy? What is your history? Who are your people? Can you push it back into the archaeological realm? And for these people who are not in the census and who, you know, are trying to become invisible and survive, it's really hard to do that. From the left, that's Chief Randy Crumey of the Santee. He unfortunately died of COVID. In the middle is Chief Pete Parr of the PD. Tom Rice, who spoke out against the apprentice, was not reelected to Congress. But Tom Rice did get a federal recognition petition on the floor of Congress in Washington introduced as a bill. Nancy Mace co-signed that. On the far right is Dr. John Creel. He is a medical doctor. He is a religious reverend, and he's chief of the Edisto Indians. And Nancy Mace introduced federal recognition for their tribe on the floor of Congress. If I was a betting man, I would say there's no chance of them ever getting it.
What's the tribe again?
Federal recognition.
Oh, yeah.
Federal recognition. We only have one federally recognized tribe, the Catawba. Sorry, the Edisto, I'm sorry. It's going to be a difficult process. They need to be able to pay historians to put their package together. They need to pay lobbyists in Washington to knock on the doors of Lindsey Graham and all these guys and get their attention and say, we need help. We need these people federally
It
recognized.
also gives them money.
It gives them an option for land. If they can get land, it's put into federal trust. Yeah.
Fact of interest is that the tribe that Creel is the chief of now didn't even recognize itself in 1968 or 9. I can't remember when we started a freedom school.
Freedom School, yeah.
Because they wouldn't let the Native American children that went to a 1 through 8th grade school. The kids in the 1 through 8th grade school didn't have a college graduate for a teacher, but they sent them into the high school and they failed out. And there had been no one in that community that was Native that had graduated from high school because of that. And they integrated the school the next year. It was a scary time. The Highway Patrol visited all the parents and threatened them to send their kids back to the Native school.
And you were part of the freedom effort?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so the pictures that I just showed you are from a state newspaper article in 2021, 218 years after the slave code. It's the same thing. We're mistreated, undermined, regulated to separate learning facilities. And Chief Randy Crummy, the fellow that died of COVID, that was chief of the Santee, he went to one of these schools and he said, there was a lot of prejudice by our neighbors, as Brett just said. And so the schools, some of them operated into the 1970s, so right after the Freedom School. This is the one, the Leland Grove School, which is over in Dillon County for Lumbee Indians. The principal was the teacher, the bus driver, and the custodian. Was a Lumbee Indian by the name of James Brayboy. And so these schools, these kind of 2-room schoolhouses were built, and some of these are standing, but most of them are gone. On the Catawba Nation, they've taken their schoolhouse and they've converted it to the cultural center. They've built onto it, but the core part of the building is one of the Indian schools. So here are the way you have to go through all these requirements, and you have to preserve, document. It's just it's a very hard thing to get through and get this process. But there are 8 tribes that are recognized in South Carolina. And here they are. So they're around the state. You've got several PD groups. You've got the Sumter tribe of the Sierra over in Sumter County. You got the Santier down in Holly Hill. You got a Natchez group in Columbia. A group of Natchez are chased out of Mississippi in the 1730s. They come to live, and the Edisto, the PD, and the Natchez had a reservation, 100 acres at the headwaters of the Ashley River for 1,000 years. It's gone. They're trying to get it back, but the deed says for 1,000 years that they would have. James Coachman gave 100 acres for this reservation. He was a white planter. Some Cherokee groups around Columbia and the Catawba Nation at the top.
Can you explain kind of the requirements to be recognized within each of those 4 groups?
Each of
The 4 categories you have, you said federally already. But
federal and state are the 2 categories.
Okay, and then there's 2 other ones. If you can go back one slide.
Yeah.
There's 2, one more.
Oh, okay. So got to be headquartered in South Carolina. You have to have a tribal role that goes back 5 years. Historical presence for 100 years, documented. Organized for the purpose of preserving, documenting, promoting Native American Indian culture and history. And then we seek to meet one more of the following needs: spiritual, social, economic, or cultural.
Okay. Yeah, I was just looking at the map and there were 4 different color codes.
Oh, yes. Sorry. There's a federally recognized tribe, there's state recognized tribes, state recognized groups are small in numbers, and the special interest organizations has now been eliminated. So if you don't have a big, you could be a recognized group, don't have 100 members, above 100 members, you can be a tribe.
People in the room, when they're talking, you're talking to the 40-something people around the state to those little microphones in the ceiling. So you need to speak up when you're talking so that people in Charleston can hear you.
Here's a quote from the recent president. You were here long before any of us were here. He's got a bunch of them in the White House. Although we have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago.
They call her, oh, God.
You don't know who this is, right?
Oh, yeah.
Elizabeth Warren. Now I'm involved in a really cool project, and I believe Hannah Barrow is one of the students here. Yeah,
As we speak.
she's been a prime mover in this group as well. Indigenized South Carolina, what we're trying to do, it's going to be very difficult, is to bring Native history to the social studies curriculum in K through 12 schools in South Carolina.
Better report you to that Florida governor.
So 2026 is the next time that they're going to revise those standards, and we've been meeting with a group of academics, teachers, Native American people, and other folks trying to figure out, and folks from the Department of Education, how do we change this history? Because a lot of Native people, their kids go to school, they identify as a Native American, and they're told by their classmates and their teachers, there's no Native Americans in South Carolina. If you can't see yourself in the curriculum, it's very difficult. And they know they're here, they know they have the history, they know they're Native, and the curriculum does not really recognize them or talk about it. If you look at the big history books on South Carolina, 12 pages on Native Americans and the rest on the last 300 years. And so we're trying to get in to revise those, to include this. I think it's going to be very difficult given the current leadership in that agency. So I think, back to Ms. Simkins, they want the same kind of things. They want jobs, they want peace, and they want equality. They want to be recognized. They don't want to be biased against. And we're hoping we can help this out. I'm part of the Native American Studies Center at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. We're trying to dispel the stereotypes and the misconceptions regarding Native American culture, their ways and languages. We're trying to collect everything we can. We've got archives. We have 6 faculty. We have an artist. Question? We have an artist. We have an archivist, archaeologist, folklorist, linguist, and historian. We all work on Native American topics. And we're trying to, we have galleries where we present these kind of things to the public. One of our galleries is devoted to having year-long exhibits on all the recognized tribes. They write the text, they select the objects for display. So it's an exhibit through their lens, through their voice. We just give them the opportunity to be in there. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 5. Come visit us at the Native American Studies Center. And at this point, I'll ask for questions.
You mentioned that during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of forests were destroyed in Europe. Is part of your research looking at how Native Americans preserved biodiversity, like lived within the environment here in the United States? And are there lessons that we can take now to revitalize our biodiversity?
Okay, I'm not personally involved in that kind of work. We can't say that the Native people lived in harmony with nature because we know, particularly in agriculture, they cleared large areas. But I think their overall ethos on nature was a lot better than what we're doing now. And there are people that are working on that. They're very much into sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry. They're very concerned with water pollution, streams and rivers. They believe water is life, and of course it is. And so they hold those things very sacred.
Professor,
Yes.
I've got a few questions that relate to your presentation, and probably a lot of these are 3-second answers. You mentioned stone vessels in the earliest Paleo Indians. Do we have any recorded examples of those stone vessels?
The stone vessels actually start in the late Archaic 5,000 years ago. And there are numerous vessels like that. Soapstone is a massive talc, very easily carved. It feels like a greasy bar of soap. That's how it gets its name. Prior to that, it would have been wooden bowls, leather bags,
Yeah.
tightly woven baskets, but they're all organic containers.
My experience with Native Americans is largely involved with Florida, the earliest pre-Columbian tribes. When you talk about shell rings, are you talking, are they equivalent to shell middens, which were so predominant in the Gulf Coast of Florida?
Yeah, Randall, that's a great question. Shell midden is a Dutch word. It literally means the garbage that you throw out your back door from your kitchen.
Yeah.
And after 5,000 years ago, when sea level approximates where it is today, we see large use of shellfish. The shell rings are built from the debris from shell middens, and the shell rings go all the way up the Florida, Georgia coast, and they end in McClellanville, South Carolina. So there's rings in Florida as well.
That's amazing. Thank you. Okay, so we're still separating Mississippian culture from what's happening on the East Coast. Is that a fair statement, or is that too general?
Well, Mississippian starts near East St. Louis on the Mississippi River, a place called Cahokia, spreads east. So the question has always been, did the people come and bring the idea, or did the idea migrate eastward? And we haven't really answered that, because what it looks like is that idea comes through of a new religion, agriculture, and platform mounts for chiefs to live on top of. Is kind of incorporated in different areas of the Southeast to whatever was going on previously.
Yeah, because it gets complicated when you start talking about the Mississippian and mound builders versus shell rings, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you for that clarification. One kind of in the general question, because of your expertise, years ago, I did a lot of research on the Florida Native Americans, and Dobbins wrote a book called Their Numbers Become Thinned, where he was very unusual in that where everyone else was saying that the population of Native Americans in the North American continent was 100,000. He was saying it was 6 to 8 million. Can you reflect on what you think the pre-Columbian population of Native Americans was in South Carolina at that time in reference to Dobbins?
Unfortunately, Randall, I don't believe in any of these estimates. I think they're probably larger than we think. How do you estimate a population before anyone's here? James Mooney, the Smithsonian anthropologist, did it. He did for all South Carolina, all the Indian tribes, 50. He estimates their population in 1650.
At what?
1650 AD. In AD 1650, and there are no Europeans here, so I don't know how we do that. My guess is there's more than we thought.
Good answer, because it's all up in the air. All right, I'm done. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll take one last question. Please go ahead.
That's an excellent lecture.
Thank
Did you say there were 8 recognized tribes in South Carolina today? Is that by the federal government or the state government?
I'm sorry, there's 8 recognized tribes by the state,
By the state.
1 by the federal
and
government.
1 by the
That
federal. Okay, thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank Robert,
you.
Brett. Thank you very so much.
Go ahead now and turn the floor over to Dr. Burnette Gallman. And again, after Dr. Gallman's presentation, we'll take some more questions as well. So if you have questions for Professor Judge, feel free to hold them until then. But now we're going to transition to Dr. Burnette Gallman.
And while Dr. Gallman's getting set up, I want to say that Professor Judge is going to have a follow-up class, the 26th of this month, which is 3 Sundays from now. We do our what we call deeper dives on Sunday afternoons from 4 to 6. They're generally about a specific thing that we want more information on. And so Chris's is going to be the 26th, 3 Sundays from now from 4 to 6. We'll be Zooming. We'll announce if it's in person or on Zoom. And Dr. Gallman is going to do deeper dives on his very expansive knowledge about ancient African history.
Giving thanks to Almighty God, the uncreated creator, the unseen source of all things, giving thanks to our ancestors who left us a blueprint if we'd only look at it. Giving thanks to our elders who lead us with their wisdom if we would only stop and listen. And giving thanks to our children who give us reasons to continue to fight some of the absurd battles we find ourselves fighting today. I'm glad to be here. There's a lot of information, so I'm probably not going to get through everything tonight. There are two things, though, Dr. Judge. You mentioned that one of your friends didn't know he was an Indian until. But I have a lot of friends from Africa who didn't realize they were Black until they came to America. And also, you know, it's also interesting. There is a phenomenon in the Low Country, predominantly, the been here's and the come here. You know what that is. The been here's know that you say Lancaster, because they say Lancaster's in Pennsylvania. So that's always something that I like to laugh at. I'm going to talk about Africa's classical civilization. And there's a reason why I called it that, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll know why. Want to dedicate this to a very, very good friend of mine who is now an ancestor. He's also a very, very close friend of Marjorie's, Mr. Bell Middleton, who had a program on South Carolina educational television in which he brought in scholars, many of whom were doing the research on a lot of the information that I'm getting ready to give you now. He had a program on South Carolina educational television called For the People. You can't even buy those. You know, it would seem as though with the demand, and I know of people all over the country that would spend a lot of money to buy those shows, but they won't offer it. And we shall see. Okay. And also dedicating to my brothers from another mother, Baba Derek Jackson, who is a 22 graduate of this class, who is also my spiritual leader, and my brother in Jegna, Joe E. Benton, my guru, who transitioned about a year and a half ago. I always say this disclaimer, my daughter doesn't like for me to do this, but I think it's only fair. I'm not a formally trained historian or Egyptologist, but my membership in the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations for the last 35 plus years has afforded me the opportunity to study with experts, people who have traveled to Egypt in excess of 100 times just to study. And I've been able to sit at their feet. So I'm going to introduce you to them later. My goals are to connect the dots between ancient Africa today and to set the record straight, because a lot of lies have been told. To understand Africa's past greatness and the basis of Africa's current potential greatness yet to be realized. And I want to stimulate maybe some of you to do further study. we're gonna move on. History and historiography. Something that fascinates me, actually, the third or fourth lecture that I give, because I'm going to also do a lecture in April. We have to come up with that time, in which we talk a little bit about historiography, but it's the study of the way history has been written. I call it the history of history. And basically, history is written from a perspective of the writer. So we have to understand that whenever we get into this. And also our acceptance of what we're being told is also dependent on that, on your own perspective. So that when we read these textbooks, is it honest? Is it accurate? You know, something can be true and not accurate, but is it accurate? And is it objective? I would submit to you that I don't know too many people that are truly objective. I'm going to go past that. Dr. Theophile Benga is a scholar par excellence, who is not only, he has degrees and postdoctoral studies in Egyptology, philosophy, linguistics. He reads and he writes ancient Greek. He is he's just awesome. And he said, a good historian must always deal with the higher structure implied by the philosophical interpretation of history. The philosophical interpretation of history. Since it appears to be endemic to human nature to struggle to form a higher meaning from experience in order to achieve a richer and fuller society. Supposedly, that's ideal. I'm going to go on and look at some of the earlier historians. Arnold Toynbee, a celebrated historian. It will be seen that when we classify mankind by color, the only primary race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the Black race. Celebrated historian. Hugh Trevor Roper. It is European techniques, European examples, European ideas, which have shaken the non-European world out of its past, out of barbarism in Africa. That's how many of us were taught. And that is the substrate of our mechanisms of thinking to this day, whether we realize it or not. Hegel, the celebrated German philosopher. The African is the natural man in its completely wild and untamed state. Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Then we have one of my teachers, Dr. Asa Hilliard. The ancient Egyptians were the Africans who created the world's oldest and most highly developed technical civilization in the history of humanity, from which flowed the civilizations throughout the rest of the world. Now, I'm asking this question. I don't think we'll get to the answer before, but you know, we back in 1991, this was the cover of Newsweek. Was Cleopatra Black? I want you to think about that so that we can have a discussion on the answer to that question. So first, before talking about ancient Egypt, we're going to talk about Nubia or Kush, because it's been found that that was a pre-dynastic civilization from which Egypt developed. And the civilization had its origins in Kush. And Kush is, Nubia is now in the southernmost part of Egypt, as well as in the northernmost part of Sudan. Nabda Playa, and we're going to talk about that a little later, a precursor civilization to Kemet, was also in Nubia. And Nubia predated Kemet by at least hundreds of years and maintain its culture and national sovereignty at least 1,000 years after Plymouth lost its independence. And one of the reasons why we don't know much about Nubia today is that when they flooded with the Aswan Dam, they flooded Nubia. So our knowledge of Nubia is limited, but a couple of things. Nubia has more pyramids than Egypt. How many people knew that? There are more than about 200 pyramids in Sudan and 118 in Egypt. And again, much of the history is submerged under Lake Nasser. And it's also, you had a rush when they were getting ready to flood it. You had a rush by Egyptologists from all over the world to go and steal some of the artifacts, so that a lot of the artifacts are still locked up in colleges. One of the main places in America where they are locked up is the University of Chicago. One of the things that I think is very, very important is Kush-venerated women, and the concept of the Queen Mother originated in Kush. And you had literally generations of female rulers in Nubia. Some of the experts on Nubia and Egypt, and I want to point these out, Dr. Deborah Hurd and Dr. Solange Ashby. They are both published widely, and they have also made, you can find them all over YouTube lecturing. They are brilliant, brilliant women. And also Dr. Shayla Monroe and Dr. Janelle Marshall. These are anthropologists, archaeologists, Egyptologists, and Dr. Monroe is a zooarchaeologist, whatever the heck that is. But they use that expertise to go and study these places. So when they say what they say is based on what they have been able to discover and prove. You know, a lot of the pushback now is coming from folks who don't know what the hell they're talking about. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. How many people know what that is? Dunning-Kruger effect. And basically that's people who don't know what the hell they're talking about, but they think they're smarter than they are. So let's talk about Africa. Kemet is in northeast Africa and was the recipient of various cultures that followed the Nile. The Nile has a flow from south to north, from the uplands of the south to the lowlands of the north. So the orientation of the ancient Egyptians is up south and down north. So that in essence, what the European invasion has done is turn Africa upside down from the way that they originally conceived it. The name Egypt was on a name that they gave. The Greeks gave it that name, and it was named after a temple. So there were other names for Egypt. The most common name is Kemet, the Black Land or Land of the Blacks. They call it Tameri, Tawi, Tanutri. The Arabs call it Mizraim, and then now they call it Mizar. And Kemet was located along the banks of the Nile, which they call the Hadith, and was surrounded by desert. I'm going to get back to this timeline. The father, you know, Egyptology was a discipline that was founded in racism. So that what I'm going to be talking about, I call chematology, which deals with what we found to be the truth, which is still being hidden. And the father of chematology is this man, Sheikh Anta Diop. He was from Senegal, and he studied in Paris at the Sorbonne. Whenever he wrote, I think he had to end up writing 3 PhD theses because they refused him, but they were all turned into books. Pre-colonial Black Africa, the African origin of civilization, and civilization and barbarism. These are excellent books, and he also, Dr. Obenga, who I mentioned earlier, was one of his students. And Dr. Diop was a linguist. He was a nuclear physicist, he's a historian, an anthropologist, historiographer, and used all those to prove his point. Here he's sitting with one of my teachers, Dr. Asa Hilliard, and this is Dr. Theophile Obenga. At the end of this lecture, there are two books that I think are excellent in terms of introducing people who are not well versed in this information. And one is written by a young man by the name of Tony Browder, called Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Tony Browder lives in Washington, in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., is the first and only Hausa, and I use that term instead of Black, African from the United States of America. He is the first and only Hausa who has funded and is conducting an archaeological dig in Egypt. And he has been given position by the Egyptian government. And the other book was written by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, edited by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who has actually edited 3 books on Egypt, but the one that I recommend very highly is called Egypt Revisited. And in that he has transcript. In 1974, I think it was, Dr. Diop and Dr. Obenga presented at the Cairo conference, which was a conference of all the Egyptologists from throughout the world. And they presented, some of which I'll present to you tonight or Sunday, evidence that the ancient Egyptians were Black. You know, there are 2 questions. Were the ancient Egyptians African? And the second question is, were they Black? Well, I think the answer to whether they were African goes without saying, because Egypt is in Africa. Even though they call it the Arab Republic of Egypt, but it is in Africa. And the Arabs didn't get there until 642 AD. And what we're going to go back is thousands of years. Dr. Obenga now is back in his home country of Congo in politics. He is also a teacher, but I had an opportunity not to study under him, but to hear him lecture several times and to have a lot of contact with him. These are also twin scholars who have led the fight, Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Yusuf Ben Yakati. Dr. Clark actually introduced Dr. Diop to scholars in America. And Dr. Ben was writing about Kemet and leading study tours from 1947 until his health failed in the early 2000s. He's self-published a lot of different books that people criticize but have not been able to disprove. What about that? Isn't it interesting that whenever someone comes up with an idea that is not considered to be good, what the powers that be do, if they can't disprove it, they indulge in personal attacks. Dr. Charles Finch, who is also a good friend that I've had an opportunity to learn from, is an Atlanta-based physician, a retired physician, he taught himself to read the Meta Nature, or what we call hieroglyphics, so that he could go to Egypt and study what was written on the walls. And he didn't need a translator because many of the people who translated it earlier were racist scholars. So he did it himself. And he also had an opportunity to learn from Dr. Diop, because he also speaks French fluently. He's one of the more brilliant people that I've ever met in my life.
Were his translations much different than what had been translated?
Yes. Yes. In fact, Dr. Obinga also translates a great deal. And you're going to see a young man who I call the new generation, who actually is teaching Meta Nature online. He's a professor at Howard University. Dr. Anderson Thompson, Dr. Jacob Carruthers. Actually, this picture was taken at Benedict. Dr. Carruthers was the very first president of ASCAC, and Dr. Thompson was one of his cronies. These are two brilliant scholars. To the left is Dr. Greg Carr and Dr. Mario Beatty in the white. Dr. Beatty is probably the national expert in hieroglyphics of Meta Nature. They both were students of Dr. Obinga when he taught at Temple, and they both got their PhDs in Africana studies from Temple, and they're both on the faculty at Howard University. I might mention that Dr. Beatty's wife is also on the faculty at Howard. Dr. Felicia Watkins is her name, and she is head of the Department of Women's Studies. And the thing I like about her is she's very, very highly critical of much of the women's movement, saying that feminism is, my favorite quote by her, feminism is white supremacy in drag. She's also very brilliant. This is Professor Tony Browder that I mentioned earlier, who is in Washington, D.C. So Dr. Hilliard, who also used to lead study tours to Egypt until his death. In fact, he died in Egypt. He said that first Kemetic culture was pre-dynastic, which is what we said earlier. It remained intact through the 7th century AD. Even though they were invaded and conquered by a lot of people, their culture remained intact. Generally, older things are better. The orientation is up south, we said that, and the origin of the people. Significant leaders came from the south. All cultural creativities were indigenous. Invasions were destructive, and Greco-Romans, when they came, were imitated. Symbolic and metaphorical thought predominate. And as you learn Meta Nature, and I don't know Meta Nature, I've flirted with it, but it's so symbolic. Science generated religion, philosophy, because a lot of the philosophical spirituality of ancient Egypt is so scientific. It's physics in many cases. It's important to be aware of the chronological order, which is what we're going to go through. Simply because when I went to the Cairo Museum, they had the late pharaohs, who frequently were Greek during the Ptolemaic period, mixed in with the Black pharaohs. So you didn't know which came first, so that you weren't able to put it in a chronological order. So Dr. Diop, the history of Black Africa remains suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until the African historians data connected with the history of Egypt. So there are a lot of racial myths about Kemet. How many of you have heard about the Hamitic hypothesis? Okay. Hamitic hypothesis, I would assume that the majority of us here are either Christian or have flirted with Christianity at some point in your life. And if you remember the story of Noah, Ham was the middle child. Now, linguistically, from what I've been taught, H and K are relatively equivalent. And vowels were not used, so that ham could be looked at as equivalent to Cam. Now, Kim, KM, in Metanetia means black. As a matter of fact, KM is the strongest word in that language for black. T as the determinative for land of. So, and if you remember your Bible, and I'm sure everybody here does, the sons of Ham were Ethiopia, Kemet, Canaan, and Libya, or what we now call Somalia. So until Napoleon went to Egypt, Hamites were known to be black. And when Napoleon rediscovered the grandeur in 1798, after the Haitians had kicked his butt, and he had to unload the Louisiana Purchase, Hamites actually became miraculously a branch of the Caucasian race. So the Hamitic hypothesis held that everything of value held in Africa was brought by Europeans. Somebody else, Giuseppe Sergi, an Italian anthropologist, came up with the brown race, which was pretty much the same. These were brown black people. The Mediterranean race, also a brown white race. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Diop said at the Cairo conference that proved that the ancient Hamites were black. Now, and after the conference, the summary was, in essence, could nobody argue against them because they didn't know. They had to depend on them. The first thing was something he called the melanin dosage test. And it's an exquisitely simple test based on the fact that melanin, the pigment found in the skin between the dermis, is preserved even after embalming over millions of years. And so if a piece of the skin is removed, exposed to ethyl benzoate, and then looked at under ultraviolet light, or the melanin granules become fluorescent, and you look at the number of melanin granules to see how much melanin that person had. So they allowed Dr. Diop to do this with a couple of the mummies, and they found out that those mummies lit up like a Christmas tree. So they refused him permission to do any more tests. He also used osteological measurements, and this is something I'm a little leery of. He used the Lepsius canon, in which those of you who know who Lepsius was, he pioneered the way bone measurements and to determine race. Blood groups, and this is also very interesting. He used ABO, and I have not found a predominant blood group in Africa because most of the sources that I've looked up will only give blood groups for African Americans. So I don't know what the predominant blood group in Africa is. Dr. Diop said that it's A. I said it's B, I'm sorry. But we do know that there are other blood groups that I don't know have ever been tested. The Duffy blood group, more common in people of African origin, Diego blood group, more common in Asians, and the Kell blood group, more common in Caucasians, which is, but I'm not aware of anyone ever testing the mummies for that. Then he used another criteria, the Kemites as they saw themselves. Well, we talked about what Kim means. It means black. And the T is a determinative meaning land. In the tomb of Ramses III, this is a reproduction of wall painting. I've seen this myself, and I took a picture. but it was so dark that my picture didn't turn out well. They wouldn't allow us to use a flash in there because they said it damages. But this is how they saw themselves. And if you look at the figure to the left, the far left is how they saw themselves. The Indo-Europeans are next. Other Africans or the Nubians were next, and the Semites were next. So he used that as witness to the Bible. We talked about Ham. Linguistic affinity. As I mentioned, that Dr. Diop was a linguist, a trained linguist. So his native language in Senegal was Wolof. And he found that there was what he called the genetic kinship between Wolof and the Meta-Necha. Obinga did the same for his Central African language. And there's a cardiologist here, my cardiologist, and I think Brett may have some familiarity with him by the name of Solomon Chisoni, who is from Kenya. And he's not a linguist, but he did some initial studies and found out that his language in Kenya, which is Kabras, also had a lot of similarities to the Meta-Necha. And I might add, there is a lot of literature now. You find a lot of ethnic groups in West Africa now that have traditions of them, their ancestors having migrated from the Nile Valley. And there's a lot of research going on in that. Human images of the period, that's gonna continue to play itself out. Cultural data, the fact that Africans were the only ones who circumcised themselves back then. In fact, Herodotus, the so-called father of history, also mentioned that. How come there were no mothers of history? Things that make you go, Also the fact that many Africans were matrilineal. Divine epithets. Beneficial gods were also always shown as black, while bad ones were shown as red. And it's interesting because this could be a whole lecture, but this whole idea of gods, the Kemites believed in one great God that had many aspects. And their symbolic thought, they used different animals to illustrate whatever those aspects were. We'll get to that a little later. But for instance, Asa, who the Greeks call Osiris, was all his title was Kemwir, the Great Black. And this is a photograph of a depiction of him. What did the authors of antiquity say about who the Kemites were? Well, there's a long list, and this is a short list of the people who mention how the Kemites looked. Herodotus probably is the most famous, and I'd like to read this. It is in fact manifest that the Colchians are Egyptian by race. Several Egyptians told me that in their opinion, the Colchians, and Colchis is an area in Mongolia and Upper Russia now. Colchians were descended from soldiers of Sesostris, who was a 12th dynasty pharaoh. I conjectured as much myself from 2 pointers. Firstly, because they have black skins and kinky hair. To tell the truth, this proves nothing for other people having too. And secondly, and more reliably, for the reason that alone among mankind, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians have practiced circumcision since time immemorial. Diodorus of Sicily, I'm not going to go over his quotes. Strabo, the geographer. Aristotle. Lucian. Apollodorus, Aeschylus, Achilles, Tatius, Amanias, and Count Volney. Now, Count Volney was a Frenchman who went to Egypt with Napoleon. And I like to read this too. But no, I just read the italicized part. This race of blacks who nowadays are slaves and the objects of our scorn is the very one to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of the spoken word. When he went and saw. And Champollion. Now, Champollion, there were two brothers, Champollion, and they were both Egyptologists. The younger Champollion is the one who translated the Rosetta Stone. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Rosetta Stone was a palette that had a writing in 3 different languages. So he managed to, before then, nobody understood the Meta-Neter. But he because it had a language that they could understand, he managed to translate it, and that's how they started knowing how to read the translation. But he had a brother, Jean-Jacques Champollion, and he said, and this is so stupid, the 2 physical traits of black skin and kinky hair are not enough to stamp a race as Negro. And Volney's conclusion as to the Negro origin of the ancient population of Egypt is glaringly forced and inadmissible. So that means black skin and kinky hair, you're white. Duh. And more recently, there's been a lot of DNA evidence. The first DNA tests that were done on royal mummies was in 2010, but they weren't publicized because they clustered closely with what was known as sub-Saharan Africans. Then later DNA tests were done that they suggested that the majority of mummies were Middle Eastern or Mediterranean or North African, which they considered non-black. Now, what they found is that the genome was E, and those B's are supposed to be small. I couldn't get, for some reason, it wouldn't obey me. The problem with that test, where they say that these dummies, these mummies tested non-African, the problem was that they only tested 150 mummies in one place in Middle Egypt. There were 147 women and 3 men. So there was not a true accurate, anybody who knows that if you're doing sampling, you got to get a wide sample.
Dr. Gallman asked me to remind you when we need to take questions.
Okay. Okay.
This will continue later. I mean, next
Okay.
Sunday.
There's one point I want to get to right here. Okay. Before, and this is it. This is a timeline that was drawn up by Dr. Asa Hilliard. And the errors, you know, we're talking about a more than 3,000 year history of a country. The classic Egyptologists had the first part, dynasties 3 to 6. They call it the Pyramid Age of the Old Kingdom. Dynasties 11, 12, they call the Literary Age of the Middle Kingdom. Dynasties 18, 19, they call the New Kingdom or the Temple or Imperial Age. And Dynasty 25, the Revival Age. Dr. Hilliard said that we're going to call that first Old Kingdom the first Golden Age, second Golden Age, third Golden Age, fourth Golden Age. Now, between the first and second Golden Age, there was what they call the first intermediate period, which was a period of civil war. And between the second and third golden age, there was a second intermediate period, which was an invasion by a group of people called Hyksos. And Hyksos translates into shepherd kings. We don't know who they were. We don't know who they were. There's some people say that they were the Canaanites. Some people say that they were Hebrews or the Hebrew, but nobody really knows, and it's only conjecture. The fourth golden age was a time when we know that the royal families of all these had their origins in the south, in the Nubian area. So toward the end of the third golden age, between the 20th and the 24th dynasty, you had a lot of mixing because people were coming in from all over. They were coming in from other North African countries. They were coming in from the Mediterranean. And the Nubians saw that happening, and they said, they're getting away from our true culture, our true religion. So they came back up to reinstate that religion. And the 25th dynasty, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you, those four ladies that I mentioned at the very first part can give you some, if you go on YouTube and pull them up, they give you some excellent information. Okay, I've been kicked out, so, okay. So I guess that means it's time for questions.
Any questions for Dr. Gallman?
Questions, comments, criticism?
Dr. Gallman,
Yes.
I've just met you tonight and I'm already your biggest fan. I just think that you're terrific. So I preface that by saying, I don't want you to think that this is a criticism at all. But I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to ignorant white people that race is a cultural construct. So my question is, if African accomplishments had been suppressed, which we know they have, by European white peoples, would we not be capable of acknowledging their accomplishments without having to necessarily prove their racial identity, which may or may not be a critical component in their accomplishments? Did that make sense?
It does, and the answer is yes, we do have to do that. You know, I hear a lot of people say, you always come with the race card. But what happens is when you consider enslavement, when you consider lynching, when you consider race massacres,
Yes.
when you consider all those things, then as a Black person, that's the only thing I can think of. That's the only card I got to play. Because my life, my father's life, my grandfather's life, my great-grandfather's life, all the way back to my fourth great-grandfather who was stolen from Angola, life was highlighted by the necessity to be Black.
The last thing I want to say is I took my 16-year-old son to see the original Wakanda movie, and I thought it was terrific, if only to put the idea of African accomplishment into the heads of narrow white people. So I understand what you're saying, but accomplishment is accomplishment. And what was happening in African culture stands on its own without necessarily being indexed to race. But I'm your biggest fan in any case.
You have the luxury of believing that.
Dr. Gallman, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I live in the
How you
Charleston
doing?
area, so I'm a Binyat who's traveled to West Africa many times as a journalist. And I'd like to know more about your comment about the migration of people from Egypt to West Africa. I think you may have mentioned that not much is known, but that research has started. Could you elaborate a little more?
Sure. And in my, not this Sunday, but next Sunday, hopefully I'll be talking about West Africa. But there are the Igbo people, for instance. There are some scholars among the Igbo people who have been tracing linguistic patterns and cultural things back to the Nile Valley. There are groups of people in, as a matter of fact, when I was in Ghana in 1996, there was a Ghanaian scholar who had done, and I'm blocking his name. I've been trying to remember who he was so I could see if I could find his research. But he had worked it out to a great deal. What I'll do is I'll see if I can find some of that information for you, and I'll be more than happy to pass that on.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Gallman, there was a question that I had. You said something about feminism being racist. What was that reference?
No, I was just talking about Dr. Valethia Watkins, who is the wife of Dr. Mario Beatty, who is I consider one of the national experts in hieroglyphics and Meta Nature. And she is she is the head of the Women's Studies department at Howard University. And I was just using one of her quotations. She said that feminism is white supremacy and drag, because the early feminists were racist.
The suffragettes. Well, I mean, some of them. Actually, we'll get into that.
They got mad at Frederick Douglass because he got the vote before they did.
We'll get into that.
Absolutely, they were racist.
Randall, you've had too many questions. Thank you, Dr. Gallman.
I think I saw a question over here.
I just didn't want to be left hanging. Was Cleopatra black?
You have to tune in next Sunday.
All right, will do.
Thank you.
All right.
I go through period by period, and then you'll be able to draw your own conclusion.
All right. Okay, so again, I think you've gotten a sampling of what the Modjeska School is all about, Brett.
I was just want to make sure we didn't cut off anybody that had their hand raised. I don't understand. That was all.
Okay. So tonight, of course, was the intro to both Indigenous life in South Carolina and getting a sense of African civilizations. Next week, we're going to dive headfirst into the colonial period in South Carolina. You got some of that from Dr. Judge's presentation a moment ago with the Yamasee War and so forth. But we'll be getting into the links between South Carolina and Barbados. I think some of you are probably aware of the fact that some of the earliest English settlers in South Carolina were from Barbados. The question is, why were they here? What brought them to South Carolina? And more importantly, what we'll get into next week is how slavery as an institution really shaped the beginnings of the colony of South Carolina, and also really shapes South Carolina going into the Revolutionary War period. So we'll be covering that next week. Yes, go ahead, please.
Is there a push for African civilization to be in the curriculum in public schools like there is for the Native American?
Repeat the question, Bob.
So the question was, is there a push to include more on African civilizations in the public school curriculum here in South Carolina, the way there is for indigenous histories? I am not entirely sure.
Yes,
Is there?
yes. As a matter of fact, back in the 1990s, I bogarted my way onto a committee that was charged with infusing Black history into the curriculum. And one of the things that some other folks and I fought for was, the fact that our history didn't begin with slavery. And hopefully, we didn't get to it tonight, but on Sunday, you'll see what we did. And then the following Sunday, because tonight and next Sunday will be ancient Africa. And the Sunday after that will be medieval Africa. So that you can see that very frequently the Africans who were kidnapped and brought here to be enslaved were not only more intelligent, but they were better educated than the people who were enslaving them. So, but there has been a push, but there's also been a pushback.
Any other questions?
Now, I'd like to pump up a bit the next class with Dr. Hill Edwards. That is the next class, right?
Yes.
This woman that is University of Virginia professor, I stumbled on a notice that she was speaking on a new book at Oxford University in Cambridge. There's a lot of stuff comes across my radar screen. And so I clicked to go, and I didn't think I'd get in. I always wanted to go to Oxford. I didn't think I'd get in, and they invited me, and I went. Very few people there. And Dr. Edwards' book is about the origins of capitalism in colonial South Carolina. And we're talking about the origins of the development of a merchant class within the population, especially of the enslaved people. And so I'm not going to go further into that, but this what she found is new history. You would not learn this anywhere else because no one else did this, and the book was published just within the last year. And so this is the type of stuff that we're bringing to the table, bringing to the fore with our presenters, is things you're not going to learn elsewhere. And so do stay tuned.